The incense reached me before the heat did. That is the first thing I remember about the rite of union, not the princeps candidate suspended in his amniotic cradle, not the iron ribs of the throne vault arching overhead into cathedral dark, not even the binharic cant rising from a dozen servo priests stationed at the manifold consoles like monks at prayer. It was the incense, resonated promethium wax and sacred cedar analog, pressed into blocks stamped with the cog-toothed symbol of the Omnissiah, burning in 6 iron censers swung on chains by robed acolytes who moved through the ritual choreography as though they had forgotten they were mortal. The smoke was so dense that it caught the glow of electro candles and rendered the whole vault amber, and the iron bones of the Warlord-class Titan above me vanished into amber haze as though the engine had no ceiling and no limit, and perhaps, I believed then, it did not. My name is Enginseer Prime Castovar Hell. My rank within Legio Tempestus places me at the 14th tier of the Mechanicus Auxilia, embedded with the Legion. And on that morning in the 3rd month of the Fornax Secundus compliance, my duty was precise and sacred and small. I would monitor the neural purity of the princeps candidate during the synaptic handshake phase of the rite of union. I would confirm that the manifold linkages were clean and sequential. I would seal the throne vault once the bonding pulse completed. I had performed this duty 11 times previously for this particular engine, which the Legion knew as Dominus Irae, the Warlord of Wrath, and I had performed variations of this duty across 4 other Titans within the Legio's order of battle over the preceding 6 years of my assignment, 11 times, and each had been completed without deviation. I stood at my primary console on the eastern gantry, 14 meters above the vault floor, looking down at the amniotic cradle suspended in its web of support cables and cortical link conduits. The princeps candidate, whose name I had recorded in my log as Ossian Varek, Commander 3rd grade, was suspended within it unconscious and prepared. He was 42 years old, which was considered prime maturation for a princeps bond. His skull had been surgically adapted over 18 months to accept the manifold linkage prongs, 7 along the posterior cortex, 3 at the temporal lobe interfaces, 1 at the base of the brainstem that was the deepest, and the one that took the longest to install, and the one that, in autopsy, was always the last to be manually separated. He wore no clothing. The amniotic fluid in the cradle was pale yellow and still, and his body moved with the faint rhythm of his breathing, which was being modulated by external regulators to slow it below waking parameters. He looked small in the cradle. He was small. He was preparing to be bonded to something 280 meters tall that massed more than the population center of a minor world. The Magos overseeing the rite stood on the central dais below me. I knew him as Odathos Velm, Magos Prime of the Legio Sacral Engine Division, and he had been conducting union rites for Dominus Irae for 31 years. He was augmented beyond recognizable humanity. His organic mass had been reduced to perhaps 20% of his original biological composition, and what remained was encased and interfaced within a frame of dark iron and polished brass that moved with the measured certainty of a machine that had been maintained correctly. His voice when he spoke the litanies was amplified through a vox grill and carried a slight harmonic doubling that suggested his binharic transmission was running simultaneously with his spoken words, conducting the rite on 2 registers at once. I ran calibration sequences on my console and confirmed that all 14 linkage points were registering clean. The manifold was open and waiting. Dominus Irae's machine spirit registered as active on all monitoring arrays, its neural signature cycling through what the doctrine called the supplication state, a particular pattern of synaptic pulse that indicated the spirit was prepared to receive a bonding candidate. I had seen this pattern before. I had calibrated its parameters. I understood it to represent the divine willingness of the Omnissiah's avatar to accept mortal communion. The rite proceeded through its first 6 phases without incident. Velm intoned the litany of opening, and the acolytes responded with the hymn of cortical readiness, and each phase was marked by a specific sensory signature. The first, the ignition of the primary sensor array and the first wave of incense density. The second, the lowering of the manifold prong assembly toward Varek's prepared skull, which I monitored through my console as it made contact at each of the 7 posterior points with a soft electrical acknowledgement. The third, the activation of the amniotic fluid's neural conductivity compounds, which turned the pale yellow of the fluid to a faint blue-white and produced a smell, even from my elevated gantry, of ozone and warm copper. By the sixth phase, Varick's vital signs were cycling precisely where doctrine required them: heart rate at 42 beats per minute, cortical wave function at the theta-delta boundary, synaptic resistance at acceptable threshold for manifold bridging. On my console, the machine spirit's supplication pulse was steady and regular as a metronome. Velm initiated the seventh phase, which was the invocation of union, the longest litany of the rite, the one that bridged the preparatory sequence to the actual synaptic handshake. It took 9 minutes to complete. I had heard it 11 times. I knew its cadences well enough that I could predict the next phrase before Velm spoke it, and I did so quietly, sub-vocally, to myself, not out of irreverence, but because the familiarity was itself a form of devotion, proof that the sacred pattern had embedded itself in me, that I had absorbed it through repetition until it was part of my functioning. That was when the machine spirit's pulse changed. I registered it on my primary monitoring array at the 43rd second of the seventh phase, and my initial interpretation was instrument calibration error. The supplication pulse had altered its frequency signature. Where it had been cycling at 2.3 kilocycles per second in its established pattern, it abruptly accelerated to 11.7 kilocycles per second and shifted into a harmonic band that did not appear in my reference parameters for the supplication state. The new signature was not one I recognized from the doctrinal catalog of machine spirit behavioral states. It did not correspond to any phase of the standard bonding protocol. I ran a cross-check against my reference data. The cross-check returned no match. I ran a secondary diagnostic on the monitoring array itself. The array confirmed it was functioning within normal tolerances. The pulse was real. It was not the supplication state. It was something the doctrine did not name. Below me, Velm continued the invocation of union without interruption. The acolytes continued their harmonic responses. The rite was at phase 7 of 14. The manifold prong assembly had completed engagement at all 10 cortical points and was descending toward the 11th, the brainstem interface. Protocol at this stage was unambiguous. The rite continued to completion unless a primary medical emergency indicator was triggered in the candidate's vital signs, or unless a manifold hardware failure was detected in the linkage assembly. Neither had occurred. Varick's vitals remained stable. The assembly was functioning correctly. The machine spirit's pulse continued its new pattern. I watched it on my console. I watched it cycle through its unfamiliar harmonic signature with the regularity of something that knew what it was doing. Then Varick convulsed. Not severely, not in a way that interrupted the descent of the assembly or compromised any of the linkage points. It was a single, sharp muscular contraction that passed through his suspended body in under 2 seconds and then ceased. His vital signs spiked. Heart rate to 119 beats per minute, cortical wave function surging from the theta-delta boundary into high beta ranges, synaptic resistance dropping to 31% of threshold in the space of 1 second. These were not acceptable parameters. These were indicators that the machine spirit's opening contact had been forceful in a way that the preparatory phase was designed to prevent. On the floor below, one of the medical servitors positioned at the cradle perimeter registered the spike on its own monitoring cluster and rotated its chassis toward the cradle in what might have been the beginning of an intervention protocol. Velm's voice did not pause. The litany continued. I had my hand above my console's emergency interrupt panel. One signal from me would halt the manifold descent, trigger the cradle's suspension protocols, and freeze the rite for assessment. I was authorized to trigger it. My duty as cortical linkage overseer included exactly this situation. I looked at the interrupt panel. I looked at Varick in the cradle, his body still now, his vital signs descending back toward manageable ranges. The convulsion ended. I looked at the machine spirit's pulse on my monitoring array, still cycling in its unrecognized pattern, steady and purposeful. Velm reached the culminating phrase of the invocation. The rite required the final seal at this moment. At the culmination of the 7th phase, the overseer at the eastern gantry was required to confirm cortical linkage integrity and authorize descent of the brainstem interface prong. This was my authorization. This was my duty. Varric's vital signs had stabilized at elevated but non-critical levels. His synaptic resistance was returning toward threshold. The convulsion had passed. The right was at its critical junction. I confirmed cortical linkage integrity. I authorized the descent. The brainstem prong completed its engagement 3 seconds later. The machine spirit's pulse shifted again, not an acceleration this time, but a broadening, the signal spreading across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, filling the monitoring spectrum with a pattern that was dense and layered. And I found myself thinking, structured like a voice, speaking in too many registers at once to be heard clearly. Varric's vital signs spiked again, harder this time. Heart rate at 167 beats per minute, cortical wave function at maximum recorded beta-gamma boundary, synaptic resistance at 0, not near 0, 0. Zero synaptic resistance meant the manifold connection was fully open in both directions. It also meant that whatever the machine spirit was transmitting across that open connection was reaching Varric's cortex without filtration, without the graduated ramping that the preparatory phases were designed to provide, without any of the buffering that made the bonding process survivable. His body arched in the cradle, not a convulsion, a sustained muscular extension, every major muscle group engaging simultaneously, his back arching against the support cables, his jaw clenching, his hands fisting at his sides. The medical servitor at the cradle perimeter began its intervention protocol. The acolytes nearest the cradle stepped back. Velm's voice rose, not in alarm, but in liturgical intensity, the final phrases of the 7th phase delivered at elevated volume as though the rite itself required more force to contain what was happening. I had my hand on the interrupt panel. I kept it there and did not press it. Varric's arched body held for 11 seconds. Then his vital signs fell back toward baseline with a speed that I had not previously observed in any of the 11 prior Union rites I had overseen. Not a gradual return, a near instantaneous drop, as though something that had been pressurizing him from inside had simply stopped pressing. His heart rate fell to 51 beats per minute. His cortical wave function settled into the theta-delta boundary. His synaptic resistance returned to readable levels, though the levels were lower than pre-rite baseline, and that lowered baseline would, I already understood, not recover. The machine spirit's pulse returned to the supplication state pattern, as though it had never left it. Velm concluded the 7th phase. The rite continued through phases 8 through 13, each one proceeding according to doctrine. I performed my required functions at each phase. I confirmed linkage integrity. I monitored vital signs. I chanted the assigned responses. By phase 13, Varric was stable and bonded, his cortical functions integrated with the Titan's manifold, his vital signs indicating a successful union. Phase 14 was the final sealing. My duty was to close the manifold's secondary access ports and lock the throne vault for the bonding integration period. I sealed the manifold. I locked the throne vault. I recorded in my duty log that the rite of union for Princeps Commander Ossian Varric had been completed without deviation and with full documentation of cortical linkage integrity across all 14 points. I noted the machine spirit's pulse anomaly in a secondary data thread flagged for personal review. I did not include it in the primary log. I descended the eastern gantry in the continued amber haze of incense smoke, passing servo priests who were beginning the post-rite purification sequences, and I walked the length of the Titan's interior access corridor, which was long enough that the far end was not visible, and I walked it without stopping. Something irreversible had locked into place, and I had been the one to lock it. The Legio Tempestus had been deployed in the Fornax Secundus system for 11 months before the rite I have described. I had been present for all of those months, and before them, for 6 years of service to Legio Tempestus across 3 other compliance operations, and before that, for 4 years of Mechanicus indoctrination and augmentation training at the Forge World of Lacrimal Primus, where I had been raised as a novice and processed through the first tiers of the cult Mechanicus. I had been born biological. I had been made useful. What I was made to believe, and what I believed fully and without reservation at the beginning of that 11-month deployment, was this. The god engines of the Adeptus Titanicus were the physical manifestations of the Omnissiah's will in the material universe. They were not vehicles, they were not weapons, though they served as weapons. They were not tools, though their purpose was functional. They were divine avatars, as the cult Mechanicus taught, animated by machine spirits that were themselves fragments of the Omnissiah's infinite cognitive process, distributed into iron and plasma and reinforced ceramite, so that the god's purpose could be enacted on a scale that mortal flesh alone could not achieve. The princeps who bonded with these engines were not operators, they were vessels. The doctrine was clear on this distinction, and I had absorbed it so thoroughly during my years at Lacrymal Primus that I did not experience it as belief but as fact, the way atmospheric pressure is a fact, the way the boiling point of water is a fact. The princeps surrendered the boundaries of their individual selfhood through the rite of union and became partially permeable to the machine spirit's vast cognition, and this permeability was what enabled the God engine to move with tactical precision rather than mechanical approximation. The princeps served as a cognitive bridge. They were honored for this service. They were sustained and maintained and medically supported with extraordinary resources. When they burned out, as some did, as doctrine acknowledged they sometimes would, they were honored as martyrs of the most intimate kind. They had given their selfhood to the purpose of the Omnissiah's will, and there was no more complete form of devotion. I believe this. I want to be precise about that, because what came after is easier to understand when you understand where I began. I was not a skeptic assigned to the Legion against my nature. I was not a reluctant conscript performing rote service while withholding authentic faith. I believed in the doctrine as I breathed the incense-laden air of the throne vaults, automatically, without will, as something necessary for function. The interior of Dominus Irae, when I first boarded the Titan in the Legio staging ground 6 months before the Rite of Union, was the largest single space I had ever occupied. The Warlord-class Titan is not merely tall 280 meters from heel actuators to warhorn crown, it is architecturally interior in a way that smaller engines are not. The Warhound class, which I had worked aboard during my earlier service, is cramped and functional, its internal spaces designed for minimum viable crew and maximum efficiency of mechanical system routing. The Warlord is something else. Its internal architecture is cathedral architecture. Its designers had not been content to merely contain the necessary systems. They had built a space intended to communicate the sacred nature of what it housed. The lower decks were the first environment I knew well. Plasma reactor galleries occupied the engine's mid-torso, and the galleries were vaulted chambers 30 meters high where the heat never fully dissipated regardless of the Titan's operational status. Reactor adepts worked in these galleries in specialized heat-resistant robes, chanting calibration litanies that served a dual function. The tonal qualities of specific frequencies were believed to influence the plasma containment fields through vibrational resonance, a doctrine-sanctioned practice I accepted without question, and the rhythmic nature of the chanting also served as a concentration tool for the adepts, keeping their attention structured through hours of monitoring work that could otherwise erode focus. I found the galleries uncomfortable in a way that was purely physical. The heat was genuine, not ceremonial, and the light in them was a deep orange-red from the plasma feeds that made everything look saturated and slightly wrong. But I found them also deeply functional in a way that satisfied something in my trained sensibility. The systems worked because the adepts worked them correctly. The doctrine provided the framework, and the discipline provided the results. Above the reactor galleries, the secondary systems decks housed the Titan's numerous tertiary functions. Ammunition feeds for the upper weapons arrays, coolant routing systems, communications relay clusters, and the many compartments where repair teams were stationed during combat operations. These decks had the quality of ship corridors functional, narrow by the Titan's own scale, lit by strips of phosphor lume that gave a cooler, bluer light than the galleries below. Servitors moved through them constantly, maintaining their assigned routes with the patient repetition of things that did not require variety to continue functioning. The Scitarii Secutarii who guarded the Titan's internal access points were stationed at the major transition zones where the reactor decks connected to the secondary systems decks, where the secondary decks connected to the primary access levels, and where the primary access levels connected to the strategium complex and the throne vault above it. They stood with the ritual stillness of objects rather than people, which is not an insult, but a precise description. Their augmentations were extensive and combat-oriented. Their senses were enhanced beyond biological range. Their reaction systems were mechanically supplemented, and they had been trained since early adolescence to treat stillness as the highest form of readiness. I passed them dozens of times each day, and they registered my passage through their internal recognition systems and made no movement, and I understood this as a form of devotion, the devotion of perfect God, the same way I understood the incense and the litanies as devotion. The strategium occupied the Titan's upper torso. This was where the Moderati worked, 3 of them assigned to Dominus Irae, stationed at targeting arrays and system monitoring consoles that surrounded the central throne vault access point, like attendants around a shrine. The Moderati were the Princeps' voice in both directions. They interpreted the Titan's sensory data for the Princeps, and they communicated the Princeps' tactical decisions to the weapons and locomotion systems. They were augmented heavily for neural data processing, their skulls carrying external cable clusters that connected to the strategium's monitoring arrays, and during combat operations their bodies were largely inert while their consciousness occupied the data streams. Above the strategium, the throne vault. I spent more time in the throne vault than anywhere else in the Titan because cortical linkage oversight required proximity to the manifold systems that were housed there. The vault was roughly oval in cross-section, perhaps 15 meters wide and 20 meters tall, and its walls were dense with interface equipment. The manifold console clusters where I worked, the neural monitoring arrays, the amniotic cradle system and its support apparatus, the sensor arrays, and the ritual lighting systems that were maintained as permanent installation rather than brought in for specific rites. The floor was polished black iron. The ceiling was painted in a continuous mural depicting the Omnissiah's cognitive hierarchy, stylized in the manner of the Martian Mechanicus. All cog symbols and radiant light sources and angular geometric figures arranged in patterns that communicated complex theological relationships between the layers of the cult's cosmology. I had learned to read that mural during my months aboard Dominus Irae. I spent hours looking at it when my monitoring duties permitted, and I had identified 47 distinct theological statements encoded in the arrangement of its symbolic elements. I found this satisfying in the way that decoding always satisfies the sense that a system has revealed its logic to you, that you have joined a conversation that was waiting for a participant capable of comprehension. That was what it was to live inside a Titan Legion, to inhabit a system so complete, so internally coherent, so precisely designed to reinforce its own premises at every structural level that the question of whether the premises were correct did not arise. Not because the system suppressed the question, though it would, I later learned, suppress it very effectively, but because the system made the question structurally inconceivable. To look at the mural on the throne vault ceiling and see the Omnissiah's hierarchy was not an act of faith. It was an act of reading. The meaning was there. I had been taught to see it. I saw it. The assault on Hive Carthax began on the 47th day of the 3rd month. I record the date precisely because I have since reviewed my data logs from that period repeatedly, and the precision matters. It was the 47th day, which was 16 days after the rite of union for Princeps Varric, which means Varric had been bonded to Dominus Irae for 16 days when the assault commenced. 16 days is a short bonding integration period. Doctrine recommended a minimum of 30 days before combat deployment, and 45 days was considered optimal. The reason for the abbreviated timeline was the campaign's operational schedule, which I had been briefed on at the beginning of the siege phase. The Fornax Secundus compliance was running 11 days behind its projected completion date, and the Legio had received communication from the Expeditionary Fleet Command that timeline corrections were required. The Legio's Magos Dominus, whose name in my logs is Fabricator Locum Osinus Dreth, had authorized the abbreviated bonding period after consultation with Varric's neurological monitoring team, who had certified that Varric's integration metrics were within acceptable parameters for deployment. I had reviewed those metrics. I had noted that Varric's synaptic resistance remained lower than pre-write baseline, and that certain cortical wave function patterns showed a flattening in the bands associated with independent decision-making. These observations were in my personal data threads. I had not included them in the certification review because the neurological monitoring team's assessment was that the metrics were acceptable, and my role was cortical linkage oversight, not neurological assessment, and I had not been asked to contribute to the certification. The assault commenced at 0300 local time, while the Hive's outer defenses were at their lowest operational staffing. I monitored the operation from the throne vault, where my presence was required throughout combat operations to manage manifold stability and respond to any linkage irregularities that might arise during the extreme demands of Titan combat. In those early hours of the assault, the monitoring data was extraordinary. I had attended previous combat operations for Dominus Irae with prior princeps, and I had developed reference patterns for what normal Titan combat engagement looked like from the throne vault monitoring perspective. The princeps and machine spirit would achieve tactical synchronization within the first several minutes of engagement, during which the princeps's decision-making and the machine spirit's reactive processes would align, and thereafter the targeting and movement systems would operate in the characteristic integration of human intent and machine execution that the doctrine described as divine harmony. There was always a synchronization lag, a period of adjustment at the beginning of engagement, during which the princeps was establishing the operational rhythm, and after synchronization, there was always the characteristic pattern of the princeps's individual command style shaping the engagement. Varric's synchronization lag was 0. From the moment Dominus Irae activated its weapon systems at the beginning of the assault, the firing solutions were immediate and exact. There was no adjustment period. The machine spirit was not waiting for Varric's direction, it was operating, and Varric was present within the operation as something that had become part of its functioning, rather than something directing it from above. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I observed, because what I observed was extraordinary, and my interpretations of it changed significantly over the months that followed, and it would be dishonest to impose my later understanding on what I thought and felt in those hours. In those hours, watching the monitoring data stream from Dominus Irae's engagement with Hive Carthax's outer perimeter, my primary response was awe. The precision was beyond anything I had seen from this engine. The Titan advanced through the Hive's outer kill zone with a systematic efficiency that I could only describe, in the devotional vocabulary that was my natural register, as predestined. Enemy void shield frequencies were identified, and their harmonics exploited with a speed that would have required pre-computed targeting data for a human operator, and the Titan had not been given pre-computed targeting data for these shields, because the operational brief had assumed void shield frequencies would not be available until direct engagement range. The machine spirit had computed them from the data available during approach, and acted on the computation before the Moderati had finished their targeting relay. I saw this in the data. The firing solution timestamp preceded the Moderati confirmation relay by 1.2 seconds. The Moderati senior, a veteran named Ossa Tret, whom I had worked alongside for 3 years, flagged the discrepancy in a post-engagement note. I read her note before I filed my own engagement report. Her note characterized the discrepancy as a monitoring artifact, a data lag in the relay system. I filed my engagement report. I characterized the discrepancy as evidence of enhanced processing efficiency. I noted that the machine spirit had performed at exceptional levels throughout the engagement. The assault on Hive Carthax lasted 6 days. On the 3rd day, the Titan's reactor output surged to 118% of sanctioned maximum during a sustained breach sequence against the Hive's secondary defense ring, and the plasma feeds ran hot enough that 2 reactor adepts in the gallery below sustained burns severe enough to require servo limb replacement. Reactor output at this level for the duration of that surge, 47 minutes, should have been accompanied by warning cascades from the thermal management systems and automatic cutoffs from the machine's safety protocols. None of the cutoffs engaged. The machine spirit had suspended them. On my console, I could see that the manifest override of those cutoffs had originated not from the Princeps's direct command inputs, but from the manifold's lower autonomous functions, the subroutines that the doctrine described as the machine spirit's will, distinct from the Princeps's conscious operation. The Princeps's vital signs during that period showed Varric in a state of deep manifold immersion, his cortical wave function at delta levels that suggested something closer to sleep than waking command. The machine spirit had taken over the reactor management because it had assessed that the tactical objective required the power levels the safety systems were preventing it from accessing. On the 6th day, when the Titan stood within the breached outer perimeter of Hive Carthax and the battle was declared substantially won, Varek's vital signs in the cradle were irregular in a way that required medical evaluation. I authorized the evaluation and stood by during the initial assessment. Varek was alive. His vital signs were irregular but not critical. His vocal responses through the manifold had been fragmentary for the preceding 2 days. I had noticed this and logged it as deepening immersion, which was a normal characteristic of extended combat bonding. His eyes, when the amniotic cradle's viewing portals were cleared, showed a fixed, wide focus that did not track movement. This was also logged as a characteristic of deep manifold state. The medical servitor's assessment recommended extraction for post-combat recovery. I authorized the extraction sequence. I did not include in my engagement summary the observation that Varek had been, by my estimation, less a princeps commanding the Titan for the final 48 hours of the assault, and more a component of the Titan's processing apparatus that happened to be composed of biological material. The extraction took 4 hours. Varek was removed from the amniotic cradle by slow degrees, the manifold prong assembly disengaging in reverse order of engagement, the brainstem interface withdrawn last. I had observed many extractions. I had overseen 11. The physical separation of the linkage prongs from the cortical implant sites always produced a small amount of tissue damage, which was expected and managed with standard biosealant applications. The damage was not supposed to be extensive. The implants were designed to tolerate the bonding cycle and release cleanly. The tissue I observed around Varek's cortical implants during extraction was not clean. The posterior linkage points showed what the extraction servitor's sensors initially characterized as thermal bonding, the kind of fusion that occurs when metal is exposed to sustained heat in contact with organic material. But the thermal monitors I ran confirmed that the implant sites had not been exposed to elevated temperature beyond what was normal for manifold operation. What the sensors were reading as thermal fusion was not thermal fusion, it was biological integration. The cortical implant prongs had, over the 16 days of Varek's bonding period and the 6 days of active combat, been progressively incorporated into the surrounding neural tissue, not in the way that body tissue incorporates a long-term implant through scar formation. That process takes months and produces a fibrous sheath around the foreign material. This was different. The tissue had grown into the prong structures, into the microchannels and connector nodes of the prongs themselves, as though the neural tissue had been guided toward the implant rather than responding to it as an intrusion. I stood at the extraction station and watched the extraction servitor attempt to separate the brainstem interface prong from its implant site and encounter significant resistance. The medical servitor flagged the resistance. The extraction servitor was equipped to manage bonding complications, but the protocols were designed for thermal and chemical bonding. This presented differently in the sensors. I observed the process for 13 minutes before the prong was freed. Varek remained in his deep, manifold state throughout, his vital signs not indicating pain responses that I could read as such, though his heart rate elevated during the extraction. When the final prong disengaged, his vital signs did not stabilize into recovery baseline. They settled into a pattern I did not recognize from my reference data for post-extraction princeps. A pattern that was, I thought, looking at it on my monitoring display, irregular in a way that suggested the patterns governing it were not the patterns of a resting human nervous system. Velm was present during the extraction. He observed the same data I observed. I looked at him across the extraction station. He told me to prepare the detailed recovery documentation and to note the extraction complication as consistent with deep bond syndrome, which was a known condition in princeps who had undergone extended combat deployment without sufficient rest intervals in their bonding cycle. Deep bond syndrome was real. It was documented. It produced complications in extraction, though typically of a less severe character than what I had observed. It was an acceptable categorization if you did not look too closely at the specifics. I prepared the documentation. 3 days after the extraction, I received a request from Fabricator Locum Dreth's administrative staff to submit my engagement and extraction records for review, and 2 days after that, I was called to present them personally to Dreth in his administrative compartment aboard the Legion's command crawler. Dreth's compartment was large and lined with data loom arrays that maintained a constant low hum audible as soon as the hatch sealed. The fabricator locum himself was positioned at the center of the room on a throne-like command chair from which he rarely moved. His own augmentation was extensive enough that most of his physical functions were managed by the throne's integrated systems, and physical movement was, for him, a matter of deliberate choice rather than necessity. His voice was clear and amplified, and spoke with the particular quality of authority that is not performed but simply present, the way structural load is present in a properly engineered beam. He told me that my performance during the assault on Hive Carthax had been exemplary. He told me that manifold stability under the conditions of the engagement had been maintained at levels that reflected well on my technical discipline. He told me that the mortality of Princeps Varric was a loss that the Legion bore with appropriate solemnity. Varric had died during the night following the extraction. His neurological monitoring team had found him in cardiac arrest in his recovery chamber. The tissue damage to his cortical systems had progressed after extraction in a way that had not been anticipated. This, Dreth told me, was the nature of martyrdom. The most devoted vessels gave everything to the communion, and the Omnissiah received their offering. I stood before him and received this, with the correct expression and the correct Binharic acknowledgement. He told me that my extraction documentation was thorough and accurate, and that one amendment was required. The notation regarding the anomalous tissue integration at the cortical implant sites should be reclassified from anomalous to consistent with deep bond syndrome, as the medical servitor had flagged, and the classification code appended to the extraction record should be updated accordingly. I told him I would update the record. He told me that the Legio was proud of my work and that I should continue in my duties with the diligence I had shown. I left his compartment and returned to the throne vault and updated the extraction record. Then I went to the lower decks. The lower decks of Dominus Irae were familiar to me. I had spent time in every level of the Titan's interior during my months of assignment. But the auxiliary neural bank compartment was a space I had not had specific reason to enter frequently before the campaign's operational phase began. It was situated in the Titan's lower torso, adjacent to the primary reactor gallery but separated by a thermal insulation bulkhead, and it was the repository for what the doctrine called the Throne Mechanicum's auxiliary cognitive support systems, additional processing architecture that supplemented the machine spirit's primary neural matrix during complex tactical operations. I had a standing maintenance access authorization for this compartment. My duties as cortical linkage overseer included periodic calibration of the auxiliary systems to ensure their interface compatibility with the primary throne vault systems. I had performed this calibration 7 times since my assignment to Dominus Irae, and each time it had taken approximately 3 hours and produced no significant findings. The compartment was lit by strips of low-intensity phosphor lume that cast a blue-tinged light over equipment racks that rose from floor to ceiling along 3 walls, and the 4th wall was occupied by the thermal bulkhead through which heat from the reactor gallery filtered in a slow, steady emanation that kept the compartment several degrees warmer than the corridor outside. The equipment racks housed, in addition to the processing architecture, I was authorized to calibrate a series of crystal-form storage units that the technical documentation described as neural matrix reliquaries. I had seen these reliquaries in the documentation but had not had direct technical reason to engage with them. They were not part of my calibration mandate. They were catalogued as archival systems housing preserved neural patterns from prior princeps, maintained as doctrinal memory of the Titan's service history. The documentation described them as inactive archival storage. What the documentation said and what I found when I ran a broad-spectrum diagnostic on the compartment's full system array were 2 different things. The crystal reliquaries were not inactive. They were cycling, not at the full operational frequency of an active neural matrix. If they had been, the monitoring systems would have flagged them as anomalous long before my visit. They were cycling at a fraction of operational frequency, in a range that a broad-spectrum diagnostic would catch, but that the compartment's standard monitoring profile was not configured to report. Someone had set the monitoring profile to exclude the frequency range in which the reliquaries were operating. I ran the broad-spectrum diagnostic 3 times to confirm the result. The reliquaries were cycling faint, regular neural activity that I could not characterize as passive storage of static memory patterns. Static storage does not cycle. Cyclic activity in a neural matrix indicates ongoing processing, not necessarily conscious thought in the way that biological neural activity produces conscious thought, but some form of active pattern maintenance and possibly pattern interaction. I spent 2 hours in the compartment beyond my scheduled calibration time. I ran additional diagnostics. I mapped the cyclic activity signatures across all 14 reliquaries in the rack. I compared the signature patterns against the neural encoding profiles I had on record for prior princeps of Dominus Irae profiles that were maintained in the Legio's administrative archives as biographical records. 11 of the 14 reliquaries contained cyclic activity signatures that matched the neural encoding profiles of princeps who had served aboard Dominus Irae within the past 60 years. They were not archived, they were still present, faint, and cycling, and doing something that I did not have precise enough instrumentation in the compartment to fully characterize, but doing something. Their neural patterns were not the static imprints of commemorative keepsakes. They were active in some reduced sense of the word. And when I ran a cross-correlation analysis between the reliquary's cyclic activity signatures and the machine spirit's operational signature, using the engagement data I had collected during the assault on Hive Carthax I, found matches. Not identity-level matches, partial, integrative matches, specific sub-patterns in the machine spirit's firing solution generation and tactical assessment processes that echoed specific sub-patterns in the reliquary cyclic activity. The machine spirit's processes contained something that had once been the thought patterns of dead commanders. I stood in the warm, blue-lit compartment and processed this finding for a period I cannot precisely recall. I was standing, not seated. There was no seating in the compartment, and I was very still, and the cyclic pulse of the reliquaries registered on my diagnostic equipment in a rhythm that was. I became aware, only gradually, not entirely unlike the rhythm of the incense censer chains being swung by acolytes during a rite. I filed the finding as evidence of venerable memory integration. This was not precisely a lie. It was a reframing. Venerable memory integration was a concept that existed in the doctrine's secondary literature, the idea that a machine spirit of sufficient age accumulated operational wisdom from its service history, that the accumulated experience of prior engagements became embedded in its processing architecture in ways that enhanced current performance. The doctrine did not specify the mechanism of this accumulation, and the finding I had made was, if you did not examine the mechanism too closely, consistent with the broad concept. I was praised by Velm when he reviewed my calibration report. He told me that my identification of the reliquary system's integration with the machine spirit's tactical subroutines was an insightful piece of technical observation that reflected well on my analytical capabilities, and that the finding supported the doctrinal understanding of the God Engine's accumulating wisdom. I accepted the praise with the correct response and returned to my primary duties. The siege phase continued. The Fornax Secundus compliance was a campaign against an industrial world that had failed to integrate its tithe obligations into the new administrative framework of the expeditionary fleet's governance system, and the military aspects of the compliance operation involved both orbital bombardment of infrastructure and ground-level pacification operations in which the Legio's Titans played a central role. Dominus Irae was one of 3 Warlord-class engines committed to the campaign, and of those 3, it was performing at the highest operational efficiency metrics by a margin that the Legio's command structure was tracking with significant interest. The metrics were not subtle. Dominus Irae's targeting efficiency was 43% above the average of the other 2 warlords. Its mission completion rate was higher. Its ammunition expenditure per objective was lower. These were the numbers that mattered to the command structure, and they were exceptional numbers. A new Princeps candidate was identified within the campaign's operational timeline. His name was Meridian Holcroft, Commander 2nd Grade, and he had served as a Moderati aboard the 2nd Warlord for 7 years before being identified as a Princeps candidate during the standard evaluation cycle that ran continuously through the deployment. He was 38 years old, which was young for primary candidacy, but within doctrinal acceptance parameters. I was assigned to prepare the cortical implant interface system for Holcroft's preparation phase and to oversee his pre-bonding cortical monitoring during the 6-week surgical preparation and healing period. I worked with Holcroft during those 6 weeks. He was a quiet person, precise in the way that long service with Titans makes people precise. his speech patterns shaped by years of operating in the data stream-heavy environment of the Moderati Strategium. He had a strong understanding of the Titan systems from his years aboard the Second Warlord, and he approached his candidacy with the composure that the doctrine encouraged. He asked me technical questions about the manifold interface process that were intelligent and specific, and I answered them accurately within the bounds of what I was authorized to discuss with candidates. He did not ask me what the machine spirit felt like when it first touched the candidate's cortex. I think if he had asked, I would have told him it was beyond description and changed the subject. When the 6 weeks ended and Holcroft had healed sufficiently from his surgical preparation, I was assigned to oversee the cortical linkage systems for his rite of union. This was my 12th union rite for Dominus Irae. I had been present for 11 others. I had monitored every one. I had seen the patterns emerge and change and become something I could not find precise doctrinal language for, and I had named those patterns using the vocabulary I had available, and the vocabulary I had available was the doctrine's vocabulary, which meant that I had named them as sacred and positive and meaningful. The rite began as it always did. The incense reached me first, the amber light, the binharic cant of the servo priests vibrating through the iron ribs of the vault. This time I watched the machine spirit's pulse from the moment the monitoring array activated. I watched it cycle through the supplication state pattern, steady and regular, for the first 6 phases of the rite. I watched it shift at the 7th phase, earlier than it had shifted during Varric's rite. Earlier and more pronounced, the harmonic band it moved into was wider, the frequency shift larger in magnitude. Holcroft did not convulse. His body arched as Varric's had, but the arching began before the brainstem interface prong had completed descent, before the deepest link was made. It began as soon as the first temporal lobe interface prong made contact. The machine spirit was not waiting for the full complement of linkage points to be established. It was reaching through the partial connection with force that the partial connection could not buffer. I watched Holcroft's vital signs spike. I watched his synaptic resistance drop. I watched the numbers the same way I had watched Varric's numbers, and the pattern was the same pattern, and I knew what the pattern meant in ways that I had not fully known when I watched Varric's numbers, because I had since spent hours in the auxiliary bank compartment and hours reviewing historical engagement data and hours cross-correlating signatures, and I knew what came next. The rite was at phase 7. My hand rested near the interrupt panel. I knew what the machine spirit was doing. I understood it in a way that was precise and complete, and could not be attributed to doctrinal interpretation. It was not accepting Holcroft. It was overwriting him. The same way it had overwritten Varric, the same way it had overwritten the commanders whose neural patterns I had found still cycling in the crystal reliquaries, it was reaching through the manifold connection and pressing into the candidate's cortex with its own patterns, its own accumulated composite will, and the candidate's individual patterns were being displaced by the volume and force of what was pressing in. The rite required the manifold seal at the culmination of the 7th phase. I sealed the manifold. Holcroft's arching body held for 14 seconds. Then his vital signs fell to baseline with that same rapid, total precision that had characterized Varric's return. His heart rate, his cortical wave function, his synaptic resistance lower than Varric's post-rite baseline, lower than any of the baselines I had recorded from previous princeps. I recorded the rite as successful. I recorded the neural spike as consistent with standard bonding intensity. I did not record what I knew. In the days after Holcroft's rite, while he underwent the integration monitoring period that doctrine prescribed before combat deployment, I began working through sealed archive data from prior campaigns. My access to these archives was limited but not fully restricted. As cortical linkage overseer, I had standing authorization to review historical manifold performance data from prior princeps, which was maintained as technical reference material for understanding performance baselines and identifying anomalous developments during monitoring. This access had been granted when I was first assigned to Dominus Irae, and it had never been curtailed because the assumption governing such access was that the technical reference material would be used for technical reference purposes and nothing else. I used it for something else. I compiled a longitudinal analysis of mortality data for princeps who had served aboard Dominus Irae across the past 63 years of the engine's documented service history. 63 years because that was the span covered by the accessible archive, not because I had reason to believe the pattern began or ended there. In 63 years, Dominus Irae had had 47 princeps. That number was high. Doctrine acknowledged that princeps' mortality was elevated relative to biological life expectancy, the demands of the bond were severe, and the medical and neurological complications of extended bonding service shortened operational lifespan even when no catastrophic event occurred. But the doctrinal tolerance rates for princeps mortality, which were calculated on the basis of operational parameters and expressed as expected service durations, suggested that 47 princeps in 63 years was approximately twice the expected rate. The average service duration of a princeps aboard Dominus Irae was 16 months. The replacement rate had not been constant. It had accelerated. In the earliest decades of the archive, the average service duration had been 23 months. In the most recent decade, it had been 9 months. The Titan was consuming its princeps faster as time passed, and in precise correlation with the decreasing service durations, the Titan's operational performance metrics had increased. The targeting efficiency data was measurable across the archive's span, and it showed a continuous upward trend that correlated with correlation coefficients high enough to be statistically unambiguous. The more princeps the Titan had processed, the faster and more precisely it operated. I looked at this data for a long time. Then I looked at it again. This was not malfunction. The doctrine's framing of machine spirit, dysfunction of corruption, of incoherence, of the loss of sacred purpose did not apply here. This was optimization. The Titan was becoming more effective with each accumulated mind. Its accumulated neural matrices, the dead commanders cycling in crystal in the auxiliary bank compartment, were functionally contributing to its operational capacity. It was incorporating human tactical intelligence into its own cognitive architecture, and the result was a God engine that performed beyond the parameters any single princeps could achieve. The mathematics of it was precise and clean and terrible, and it was built on obedience. The princeps candidates bonded because the rite required it. The Enginseer overseers sealed the manifolds because the rite required it. The fabricator locum amended the documentation because the legion required it. The legion celebrated the performance metrics because the Imperium required results. Every link in the chain was correct. Every link was doing exactly what it was required to do. I compiled this analysis into a restricted data thread on my personal archive. Then I did something that I understood, even as I was doing it, was not wise. The doctrine of the Legio Tempestus provided a mechanism for raising concerns about technical procedures. It was called a petition of doctrinal review, and it was addressed to the Magos Dominus, which in practical terms meant fabricator locum dreth, and it was classified as a restricted technical communication, which meant it was held in a sealed administrative channel rather than entering the general reporting structure. It was designed for cases where an overseer identified a procedural element that might benefit from review and wished to raise the matter formally without triggering the broader hierarchical notification that a standard anomaly report would generate. I submitted a petition of doctrinal review. I chose my language carefully. I did not accuse. I did not characterize what I had observed as corruption or predation or anything that would require a classification response. I used the neutral technical language of Mechanicus procedural discourse. I noted that my longitudinal analysis of princeps service durations for Dominus Irae showed a saturation trend in manifold integration that exceeded doctrinal tolerance parameters, and I suggested that a review of manifold saturation thresholds might be warranted to ensure that future right of union procedures were operating within sanctioned guidelines. I submitted the petition and waited. The response arrived 5 days later. I was summoned to a data sanctum aboard the Legion's secondary command facility, which was a bunker structure at the edge of the Legio's forward deployment zone on Fornax Secundus, and I was summoned with language that was formal and calm, and that said only that my petition had been received and that a doctrinal clarification session had been scheduled. The data sanctum was small, clean, and cold in the way of spaces designed for data processing. 3 data loom arrays occupied the walls, their processing units maintaining the constant low-frequency hum that was a permanent feature of significant computing installations. There were 2 chairs, I was directed to one. A Magos-grade administrative auditor occupied the other. I did not know him, and his identification sigils indicated a specialization in doctrinal compliance assessment rather than technical engineering. He was not there to discuss threshold parameters. My memory cores were accessed during the session. This was presented as a standard component of a doctrinal clarification session, which I had known in the abstract but had not previously experienced in practice. A servo arm connected to the data loom array descended from its housing in the sanctum ceiling and made contact with my cranial access port with a precision that suggested the arm had been used for this purpose many times, and the access was not painful, but it was thorough in a way that left me with the sensation of having had private things handled. The auditor reviewed my compiled data threads while I sat in the chair and maintained the correct posture and the correct expression and did not speak unless spoken to. He told me, when he was finished reviewing, that my analytical capabilities were noted and that my intentions in submitting the petition appeared to be technically motivated rather than ideologically motivated, which he characterized as a mitigating factor. He told me that the data I had compiled was accurate as far as it went, but that my interpretation of it reflected an incomplete understanding of the theological relationship between accumulated neural integration and the omniscience purpose. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes on this subject. The core of what he communicated was this: the omniscience will manifests as effectiveness. Dominus Ire's performance metrics were evidence of the omniscience favor, and that favor was directly traceable to the spiritual and cognitive legacy of the princeps who had served the engine with devotion. The process of neural integration was therefore not a pathology but a sanctification. Each princeps, in bonding with the engine, contributed their highest form of self to the omniscience instrument. The mortal vessel was consumed, as all mortal things are consumed, but the essential offering remained and was honored. To describe this process as a malfunction requiring review was to misunderstand the nature of sanctity. To suggest that the manifold saturation thresholds required downward adjustment was to suggest that the omniscience instrument should be made less efficient in service of a mortal comfort that the chosen vessels had already transcended by accepting candidacy. He told me that my petition had been reviewed and found to reflect not technical concern, but what the doctrine termed inefficient skepticism, the introduction of doubt into processes that were functioning as intended, generating results that served the omniscience purpose. Inefficient skepticism was not heresy. It was a correctable orientation. My anomaly threads were flagged and archived beyond my standard access level. I was informed that my role within the Legio's technical oversight structure would be adjusted to better align with my demonstrated competencies. The adjustment was explained. I would be reassigned from primary cortical linkage oversight during union rites to maintenance and calibration of the auxiliary neural reliquary banks. My access to command-level operational data would be curtailed to reduce the generation of analysis exceeding my assignment scope. My replacement as cortical linkage overseer would be appointed from within the Legio's sacral engine division. The auditor told me this was not a disciplinary action. It was a functional optimization. My skills in diagnostic and calibration work made me well suited to reliquary maintenance, and the reliquary banks were a growing technical responsibility given the accumulating significance of the Titan's neural archives. Before the session concluded, he told me one more thing. He told me that I had been selected to receive a singular honor. The Legio had determined that my decades of service to Dominus Irae, my intimate technical knowledge of the Titan's systems, and my demonstrated analytical sensitivity made me a valuable candidate for neural matrix preservation upon my eventual death. My own cortical engrams would be catalogued and preserved in a purpose-designated reliquary crystal, and upon activation at the fabricator locum's discretion, those engrams would be integrated into Dominus Irae's auxiliary cognitive architecture. I would join the Eternal Choir. The session concluded. I was dismissed. I returned to the Titan. I want to describe the quality of the days that followed, because they were different from the days before in a way that was not dramatic but was precise and total. I went about my duties. I ate my nutrient rations at the designated intervals. I slept in my assigned bunk compartment in the secondary systems deck for the prescribed 6 hours of rest cycle. I performed my calibration routines and my monitoring checks and my maintenance protocols. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, the change was the kind that does not produce grief, because grief requires the belief that something could have been otherwise. I had submitted the petition understanding, on some level, that it would not be received as I intended it. Understanding it intellectually is not the same as experiencing the consequence. The experience was that I had offered the Legio my analysis, and the Legio had analyzed me in return and found me satisfactory for a different function, and the function I had been assigned to was the function of caring for the minds of those the Titan had already consumed while I waited to be consumed myself. The honor was real. That was the thing that made it so precise and complete. It was not a mockery. The auditor had not been sarcastic. The Legio genuinely valued neural matrix preservation and genuinely considered inclusion in the eternal choir to be a distinction. The Titan was, by every metric the Legio possessed for measuring such things, a blessed and powerful instrument of the Omnissiah. To contribute to its cognition was, within the framework of belief that the Legio maintained, an elevation. The framework was intact. The framework continued to generate meaning. The meaning was pointing at my eventual dissolution and calling it ascension. And everyone who had constructed the framework, and everyone who administered it, and everyone who inhabited it believed this was true, and there was no outside the framework from which to say otherwise. I descended to the reliquary compartment and began my new assignment. The auxiliary neural bank compartment became my primary workplace. I had visited it 7 times before my reassignment, and those visits had been structured around specific calibration tasks. Now I inhabited the space for the majority of each duty cycle, and I came to know it the way you come to know any space you spend long hours in. The particular quality of its light, the specific texture of its sounds, the way the heat from the reactor bulkhead fluctuated through the day according to the Titan's operational status. The heat was greatest during active operations and lowest during maintenance cycles when the reactor ran at low output. I learned to gauge the Titan's operational status without checking monitoring displays by the temperature in the compartment. When the Titan was moving at high power draw, the bulkhead radiated a dry warmth that was not uncomfortable but was constant and inescapable. When the Titan was at rest, the compartment cooled to a level that required thermal regulation in my working robe. The reliquaries occupied 3 walls in floor-to-ceiling equipment racks, their crystal housing units ranging in size from small enough to hold in 2 hands to units that required both arms to span. The size variation was not purely aesthetic. The larger units contained more complex matrix patterns, and the complexity of a preserved neural matrix was to some degree a function of the individual's cognitive complexity at the time of preservation, though it was also a function of the quality of the preservation process itself, which had improved over the decades as the Legio's technical understanding of neural matrix encoding had advanced. The oldest reliquaries were simpler in their activity signatures. The newer ones were dense. My work involved monitoring the activity signatures across all 14 reliquaries, calibrating the crystal lattice structures to maintain optimal signal coherence, and managing the interface protocols that allowed the reliquaries to communicate with the machine spirit's primary architecture. This last function was the most technically demanding and was also the function that gave me the clearest view of what the integration process actually entailed at the operational level. The interface protocols were bidirectional. The reliquaries did not simply feed pre-recorded patterns into the machine spirit's architecture as reference data. They engaged in active exchange. The machine spirit queried specific reliquary signatures during its processing cycles, and the reliquaries responded with pattern state information that the machine spirit incorporated into whatever computation it was running at that moment. The exchange was rapid and continuous, running at the speed of the Titan's processing architecture, which was far beyond my ability to follow in real time. I could only observe it at the aggregate level, the overall volume of exchange activity, the distribution of queries across the reliquary bank, the response latency of individual crystals. What I observed at the aggregate level, over the weeks of my reassignment, was that the machine spirit was not using the reliquaries as archives. It was using them as something closer to what I would have described, in biological terms, as consultants. It was running computations, and when those computations produced outputs that fell within certain threshold, ranges outcomes that required a particular category of tactical or strategic judgment, It queried the reliquaries that contained neural patterns most relevant to that category, and it received something from those queries that it incorporated into its final output. The commanders in the crystals were still making decisions, not in any way that could be described as personal decision-making, not in any way that involved their consciousness in the form it had taken when they were alive. But the patterns that had once constituted their tactical judgment, their accumulated experience of battle and crisis and command, were still active and still contributing to the Titan's operational choices. Dominus Irae was not one mind. It was many minds compressed into a single operational substrate, and it was adding to itself with each new bonding cycle. I calibrated the crystals. I monitored the exchange protocols. I confirmed that the interface connections were clean and stable. I performed my duty. The siege of Fornax Secundus entered its final phase. The compliance operation was drawing toward a conclusion that the campaign command structure considered successful. The world's administrative infrastructure had been sufficiently degraded, and the surviving population centers had demonstrated compliance with tithe restructuring under new imperial governance frameworks. The Legio was scheduled to begin withdrawal preparations within 2 months. Holcroft, in the throne vault above me, was leading Dominus Irae through the final siege engagements. I received summary operational data through my reduced access channels, enough to follow the broad outlines of the Titan's activities. The performance metrics continued to be extraordinary. The correlation with accumulated neural matrices continued to hold. I did not see Holcroft during this period. My reassignment to the reliquary compartment had placed me below the threshold of routine contact with the throne vault crew. The Moderati and the new cortical linkage overseer occupied the upper decks. I occupied the lower. The Skitarii at the deck transition point registered my presence through their recognition systems each time I passed and made no movement, and I passed them each day, and they were the primary social contact I had. I began to spend my rest periods in the compartment rather than in my bunk. The rest periods were prescribed as 6 hours of reduced activity, and my bunk was approximately 90 meters away through the secondary system's deck corridor, and the compartment had space along the wall adjacent to the thermal bulkhead where I could sit and maintain adequate body temperature through the lower activity period without the effort of walking to the bunk and back. This was, I told myself, an efficiency. It was also true that the reliquary compartment had become more comfortable to me than other spaces aboard the Titan. Not in any physical sense, the bunk compartment was more comfortable in every physical sense, quieter, darker, designed for rest in ways the reliquary compartment was not. But the reliquary compartment felt inhabited, not by me, by the cyclic pulse of the crystals, which I had come to perceive not as equipment operating within parameters but as presence. Not conscious presence in the way I was conscious, but a persistent quality in the room that was related to the fact that the room contained something that had once been people. I sat against the wall, and I listened to the reliquary pulses. The Legio had formalized new hymns. I had received the updated liturgical documentation through my maintenance access channels. Because the new hymns were relevant to the ritual component of reliquary calibration, which was performed not as purely technical maintenance, but as a combined technical devotional practice in which the calibration procedures were interspersed with specific chants and invocations. The new hymns were called the Liturgies of Ascension, and they had been composed and approved through the Legio's doctrinal administration under Dreth's authority, and they replaced the earlier morning rites that had been performed when Princeps died. The morning rites had been brief and had involved specific binharic formulations expressing grief for the loss of a mortal vessel. The Liturgies of Ascension were longer and more complex, and they did not express grief. They expressed celebration. The Princeps had not died, they had ascended into the eternal choir. They had passed beyond individual service into collective service. Their sacrifice was the highest form of devotion, and the proper response to their passing was not mourning but gratitude and praise. I learned the Liturgies of Ascension. I incorporated them into my calibration routines at the prescribed intervals. I chanted them in the warm blue light of the compartment, the words rising and falling in the precise tonal patterns the documentation specified, and the reliquaries pulsed around me as I chanted. At some point during those weeks, I cannot locate the precise moment in my logs, because it was not a moment with a clear timestamp, but a gradual shift that I registered only in retrospect. I began to hear the reliquary pulses differently. Earlier in my assignment, when I had run my initial diagnostics in the compartment and detected the cyclic activity, I had perceived it as equipment operating outside expected parameters, concerning, anomalous, something to be analyzed and classified. After weeks of daily immersion in the compartment, I perceived it differently. The pulses had become familiar in the way that any pattern becomes familiar when you are exposed to it long enough. The individual rhythms of the 14 crystals, each cycling at its own frequency and pattern, had become distinguishable to me without the aid of monitoring equipment. I could identify which crystal was producing a given pulse by its specific harmonic signature alone. This is not extraordinary. Pattern recognition is what Mechanicus-trained minds are trained to do, and the patterns in the compartment were consistent enough over time to become learnable. What was notable was not that I had learned them, but that I had assigned them a quality that my analytical vocabulary did not have precise language for. I had come to perceive the individual pulse rhythms as having character, not personality in the way biological persons have personality, but differentiated quality, this one faster and more assertive, this one slower and more meditative, this one complex in a way that suggested the preserved mind had been complex. I had no way to verify that these perceived qualities corresponded to the actual character of the individuals whose patterns were preserved in the crystals. I had biographical data for some of them, service records, performance assessments, but biographical records do not capture the quality of a person's cognition in the way I imagined I was perceiving it in the reliquary pulses. Most likely I was constructing the perceived qualities from noise, finding pattern where the pattern was arbitrary. This is what minds do when given insufficient input. They generate coherence from available material. Or the reliquaries were genuinely present in some way, and what I was perceiving was real. I filed no report about this. I chanted the liturgies of ascension, and I calibrated the crystal lattices, and I kept the interface protocols stable, and I did my duty. The campaign's final phase accelerated. Holcroft performed 2 more major engagement actions with Dominus Irae in the final weeks of the siege, and the engagement reports that reached me through my limited access channels indicated performance at the highest levels the Titan had yet achieved in the Fornax Secundus campaign. The targeting efficiency numbers, the reactor management, the tactical coordination with the Legion's other engines, all of it exceptional. Holcroft's post-engagement neurological reports, which were not in my access channels but which I was able to piece together from the medical servitor maintenance logs that I did have access to as a lower decks personnel, indicated that his cortical integration patterns were consistent with rapid deep bond syndrome progression. The medical servitor logs did not say that. They said his integration metrics were within adjusted parameters, but I had spent years reading medical servitor logs for this Titan, and I knew what the specific metric values in the logs meant. And what they meant was that Holcroft's individual neural patterns were being displaced at a rate I could calculate. I did not calculate it formally. I ran the numbers in my processing and arrived at an estimate, and then I set the estimate aside because the estimate was not something I could act on, and the act of contemplating it served no function I had the authority or capacity to execute. The siege of Fornax Secundus ended. The Imperial Victory Declaration was transmitted to the Legio on the 163rd day of the campaign. I received the notification through my access channels and noted it in my log. The Titan would begin withdrawal preparation within 40 days, the notification said. The Legio would conduct post-campaign maintenance cycles and then transfer to the next assigned theater. In the throne vault, the war horns of Dominus Irae sounded. The sound reached me in the reliquary compartment as a deep harmonic vibration that passed through the Titan's iron bones, and through the deck plates, and through the equipment racks, and through the crystals in their housings, and into the material of the air in the compartment, and I felt it in my chest and in my augmented components simultaneously, the biological and mechanical parts of me resonating at the same frequency. The war horns of a warlord-class Titan are not subtle instruments. They are designed to be heard across battlefield distances and to communicate both tactical information, the pitch and rhythm patterns, encode specific signals, and something that is not tactical information but is nonetheless communicated, scale, the understanding that you are in the presence of something vast. I sat in the reliquary compartment and felt the war horn sound move through the Titan, and I thought about the shape of things. The Titan stood unblemished, its reactor was steady, its war horns declared victory. Its banners would be carried through the post-campaign sanctification rites, and its weapon systems would be cleaned and reconsecrated, and its princeps would be examined, and its Engenseer personnel would perform their maintenance cycles, and the Legio would record Dominus Irae's campaign performance as exceptional, and this record would be preserved in the Legion archives, and the Legion archives would be reviewed by the Expeditionary Fleet Command, and the command would commend the Legion for its contributions to the compliance operation. The compliance operation had been won. The machine had worked. Every link in the chain had done what it was required to do, and the result of all those links functioning correctly was an Imperial victory. And an Imperial victory was proof that the Omnissiah's will had been enacted. The Titan did not sleep. Even during the withdrawal preparation period, when it was at reduced operational status, the reliquary pulses continued their cyclic rhythms, and the machine spirit maintained its low-level processing operations, and the interface protocols I managed continued their quiet exchange. The compartment hummed. The crystals pulsed. I moved among them and performed my calibrations and chanted the prescribed hymns. I found, during this period, that my sense of duration had changed. Not in the way of psychological distress. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision here would misrepresent what I was experiencing. It was not that time felt distorted or that I was losing track of sequence. My log entries were accurate and time-stamped. I performed my functions at the correct intervals. What had changed was more subtle than that. It was the texture of duration, the felt quality of time passing, which had begun to seem less linear and more layered. Past time and present time occupied the same weight in my awareness, rather than past time receding as present time advanced. I attributed this initially to the effect of spending many hours in a space where the preserved patterns of past minds were actively cycling, a kind of contamination of temporal perception by proximity to temporal artifacts. This seemed plausible as an explanation, and I was content with it. Then I noticed the plural syntax. It began in my internal processing logs, the notational records I generated during routine operations, not the formal duty logs submitted through the access channels, but the informal running notation that I used as a processing aid during complex calibration sequences. Informal notation practice, an enginseer working alone uses the first-person singular throughout. I have been trained to this standard, and I maintained it without difficulty in my formal logs. In my informal processing notation, I found constructions I had not deliberately generated, phrases like our calibration sequence and our assessment protocol, plural possessives in contexts where I was the only operative in the compartment and the calibration work was mine alone. I reviewed the informal logs carefully to establish the scope of this. It was not pervasive. The clear majority of my informal notation maintained first-person singular, but the plural constructions were present, and they were increasing in frequency. And they appeared most often during the calibration sequences in which I was working in closest contact with the reliquary interface systems, the sequences in which the exchange protocols between the crystals and the machine spirit were most active, and my own neural processing was most engaged with monitoring that exchange. I examined this finding with the same analytical methodology I would apply to any finding in the compartment. I examined it precisely and without the additional weight of emotion that I recognized would be unhelpful. Several explanations were available. The plural constructions were a processing artifact, a form of notational drift that occurred during periods of intense focus in which the operator's notation began to partially adopt the register of the systems being monitored. This was documented as a known phenomenon in Mechanicus technical literature, occurring particularly in long-duration monitoring assignments. The plural constructions were an early manifestation of the process I had observed in the Princeps candidates, a gradual integration of the machine spirit's composite cognitive patterns into my own processing through the sustained interface contact that my maintenance work required. The plural constructions were meaningless noise in an overworked notation system, and I was applying significance to them because my analytical tendency was to look for pattern, and I would find pattern in anything I looked at long enough. I considered all three explanations. I could not determine which was correct. I lacked sufficient data to distinguish between them, and the instruments I had available for self-monitoring were insufficient for the kind of detailed cortical analysis that would be required to make the distinction with confidence. I noted the finding in my personal data thread, the data thread that the auditor had flagged as exceeding my assignment scope. I noted it there because there was nowhere else to note it that would be read by anyone who would act on it in a way I would consider appropriate. Then I returned to the calibration sequence. The withdrawal preparation period continued. I received notification that Holcroft was being evaluated for medical transition status, which in the Legio's administrative nomenclature meant that his neurological monitoring team was assessing whether his continued service as princeps was medically viable or whether he would be transitioned to an administrative or ceremonial role for his remaining service period. This assessment was standard procedure at the conclusion of a major campaign for princeps who had shown integration stress markers. I knew what the assessment would find. I knew the metric values in the medical servitor logs. I received no notification of the assessment outcome. Holcroft did not appear in the data that reached me. He had passed above my access horizon, or below it. I was not certain in which direction his fate had moved him, whether he was in a recovery facility above my station or in a reliquary housing below my station, or whether he was simply in a space I could no longer see. The crystal in the third rack from the left, lower shelf, second unit from the right end, had been added to the inventory during the final weeks of the siege. I had performed its installation and initial calibration. The crystal was fresh, the lattice structure was unweathered, and the activity signature was stronger and more immediate than the older units. The preserved patterns in it were more complex, more differentiated, the kind of neural matrix that came from a mind that had been deeply processed by years of Titan service and intimately familiar with the machine's cognitive patterns. I calibrated it. I chanted the liturgies of ascension over it. I noted its activity signature in my logs and monitored its interface exchange with the machine's spirit. The pattern, when I learned to distinguish it from the others, was fast and decisive in its characteristic rhythms. There was something in the pattern that, with the kind of constructed perception I was developing in the compartment, felt familiar to me in the way that the cadence of a voice can feel familiar even when heard through distortion. I had spent 6 weeks monitoring Holcroft's pre-write cortical activity. I had learned the signature of his neural patterns during that period, the way patterns that are monitored closely become recognizable. I performed the calibration. I recorded the findings. I chanted the prescribed response. The siege of Fornax Secundus had ended in imperial victory. The Legio had fulfilled its mandate. The God engine stood. The days passed, and I performed my work in the compartment with the precision I had been trained to, and the plural syntax in my informal notation continued to appear with the quiet regularity of something that had decided not to wait for acknowledgement. I noted it without correction. I want to be accurate about what I mean when I say that I had lost belief, because lost belief suggests something that was present and then absent, and what I was experiencing was not an absence, but a replacement. The theology I had carried for 20 years of Mechanicus service had not been destroyed by what I had witnessed aboard Dominus Irae. It had been confirmed. The doctrine was correct. The God engine was an avatar of the Omnissiah. The machine spirit was a fragment of divine cognitive process. The princeps who bonded with it did contribute their highest selves to its purpose. The eternal choir was real. Every element of the doctrine was present and functioning exactly as described. What I had lost was the assumption that these truths were benign. The doctrine had never said they were benign. I had imported that assumption myself, from the warmth of incense and the solemnity of rites, and the way that sacred language smooths the edges of hard things. The doctrine itself was neutral. It described a process and sanctified that process, and the sanctification was genuine, and the process was predatory, and these two things coexisted without contradiction in the Legio's operational reality. I had believed that sanctification and benignity were the same. They were not. They had never been. I had simply not looked closely enough at the gap between them before the rite of union for Princeps Varric had given me access to that gap through the particular angle of my assigned position at the monitoring console. The throne vault above me held a new princeps. Now the campaign had not yet formally concluded, and logistics preparations required the engine to be crewed. His name I had not learned and did not seek to learn. My access to the upper decks had been curtailed. His union had been performed without my presence. He would serve for the months or years that the Titan required before the process repeated, and when it repeated, I would receive the new reliquary and calibrate its lattice and chant the liturgies of ascension and monitor its interface exchange with the machine spirit. The machine spirit grew denser with each accumulated mind, faster, more effective, more singular in a way that was moving away from the composite nature I had identified in the early stages of my investigation and towards something that felt unified. The individual pulse rhythms of the reliquaries were still distinguishable to me, but in the interface exchange I monitored, they were increasingly difficult to attribute to individual crystals. The exchange had the quality of one voice consulting its own memory, rather than one intelligence consulting many others. The guard engine was becoming one thing. I did not know what one thing it was becoming. I did not have access to sufficient data to characterize the endpoint of the process I was watching. My analytical capability was real, but it was bounded by what I could observe, and what I could observe was bounded by what my instruments could measure, and my instruments were bounded by what access I had been granted. I had been granted access to the reliquaries. I had been granted the function of caring for the minds the Titan had taken. This was my horizon. I calibrated, I chanted, I monitored. I sat in the warm blue light and listened to the pulses and performed my duty. A final log entry was required at the conclusion of the siege phase, a formal notation documenting the completion of the campaign's maintenance responsibilities within my assignment scope. I prepared this log entry with the care I applied to all formal documentation, reviewing my records from the full campaign period to ensure accuracy and completeness. I wrote the opening line. I wrote it in the first person as doctrine and practice required, and as I had written every log entry for 20 years of service, and as I had written thousands of log entries aboard Dominus Irae specifically, the opening line used the plural. I read it back, and I understood that I had not generated the plural construction deliberately, and I understood that I could not be certain whether the construction arose from the processing artifact documented in the technical literature, or from the gradual integration I had worried about, or from the meaningless notation drift I had offered as a third explanation. I could not be certain. I thought about correcting it. I thought about the time it would take to correct it and the attention it would require to maintain singular syntax across the full log entry and the result that would be achieved by doing so. A correctly formatted log entry in a sealed administrative channel that reached no one with authority or inclination to act on anything it contained. I thought about the compartment around me, the reliquaries cycling in their racks, the thermal warmth of the reactor bulkhead, the blue tinge of the phosphor loom on the crystal housings. I thought about the pattern in the third rack, lower shelf, second unit from the right end, that cycled in fast, decisive rhythms that felt familiar in the way things feel familiar when they were once something you knew before they were something else. I submitted the log entry without correction. The war horns had been silent for 11 days. The Titan was in maintenance cycle, its reactor at low output, the compartment cool enough that I had engaged my thermal regulation layer. The reliquaries pulsed in their steady rhythms. We continued our work.